Ko te mea tūtahi, ka nui te mihi kia koutou, ka tūau, kei mua i a koutou, ko wai tēnei, he uri tēnei no te rarawa ki te taha o tōku pāpā, no ngai tiriti, tōku māma, i whānau mai ahau ki o tautahi, koina te wāhi i tupu ake ai ahau, engari kei te noho au ki pōneki tēnei wā ki te taha o tōku hoa rangatira me o māua tamariki, te tokotoru karetapu. Kia ora everybody, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And it's my first visit actually to St John's, so I feel the weight of history here and the weight of other things as well. So ka nui te mihi kia koutou. Ka nui hoki ngā mihi kia rātou mā kua kōrero hia kētia. Thank you for those who've already spoken. I've learnt quite a lot already. Point to note, when you're amending your PowerPoint slides on the plane, it doesn't save it properly. So I think there's still a difference, I'm afraid, between what I have here and what the PowerPoint slides are saying. So let's just move right along. I'll fill in the gaps where they come. Okay, so what I want to do today, and I don't know if it's going to... Oh, it does. Excellent. All right. Okay, maybe not. Right, so there's a couple of... I'm really grateful to come after Sam, because actually a lot of what Sam was talking about, I'm talking about as well from a slightly different angle. I'm not talking so much about Māori political authority, but Maori constitutionalism. I'm elevating what Sam's been talking about to constitutionalism, the way in which we make rules about rules as Māori. And so I want to talk a little bit about Māori constitutionalism, and I'm talking about it, Sam used the phrase supra-tribal, and I've been using that phrase as well, supra-hapu, supra-iwi. This idea that Māori are able to cohere as a constitutional kind of people, the difference between that and the state constitution and the way in which we probably understand constitutional institutions, etc., courts, parliament, executive, the organs that make the things happen, mainly for Māori at that supra-tribal level, we don't have the power. So what we have to do instead is use that civic decision-making, which I'll talk to in a little while, but that's the distinction, right? We don't have the power to affect change in the way that the state constitution does. So I want to concentrate today on Māori constitutionalism, and I better start hurrying up because I can already feel the minutes slipping by. And it's great seeing Sam's figures on the words in regards to the texts that he was looking at, because I've got some figures of my own which we'll talk about shortly. But the point for both of us, I think, is to get close to stuff, to look at what people actually do and what they say, rather than try and investigate institutions or investigate values. Actually, look at what people do and infer from what they actually do. And that constitutional realism, I think, can change the way we view Te Tiriti and the role of Te Tiriti in today's society. And I'll mention a little bit about that too. We're having our gathering just a few days after the constitutional kōrero that was held at the University of Auckland that Alistair and I were at, and I think maybe some other people in this room, which was all about the future of Aotearoa New Zealand, all about Māori futures, and also about Te Tiriti, although interestingly Te Tiriti was very rarely mentioned, which I think I have a reason why a little bit later. And what was really clear in the constitutional kōrero was that there's a major tension. This tension's been around for a long time, and that tension is between incrementalists, those who want to affect change, kind of like the yeast in the bread, right? Over a period of time, over many years, you're working from the inside out, you're working to transform institutions, but slowly, right, incrementally. and those who would see transformation, which really means replacing one set of values with another set of values. So constitutional transformation. And when you have Joe Williams and Ani Makaere in the same room at the same time talking constitutional transformation, I'll leave you to guess which one was which. But one was an incrementalist with transformational tendencies, and the other was a transformationalist without that many incrementalist tendencies. So that's a major, major tension when it comes to understanding Maori constitutionalism, I think. So I will, but what I will say, and I've just got it up here, both approaches are working towards the notion of a public good. In other words, a good that is good for Māori and therefore for the rest of the country. So that's where we get to this kind of constitutionalism, is this idea of a public good. And Ngāpuhi, of course, gave us the first gift of the public good in the signing of the Declaration, Tēnā koe hoa. I'm not sure if this is working, so I'll just use this. All right, so I mentioned the idea of kind of looking at what people do and looking at what people say and the practices that we evolve over time. And there's a phrase for that, which is constitutional realism. And as Sir John Salmon talked about back in the turn of last century, constitutional practice is logically prior to constitutional law. It comes from the people rather than imposed upon the people. Now, I got annoyed back in 2007 when my old boss, Dr. Matthew Palmer, now Palmer J, wrote a paper about New Zealand's constitutional culture. And so he came up with probably quite an accurate way of putting it, really, that there are three core ideas that you can see seeping through the New Zealand state constitution, those three values or ideas being authoritarianism, egalitarianism, and pragmatism. And I read this article and I thought, but what about Māori? What culture is what people do and what people say, and they repeat it over time, and they repeat it through generations. What is Maori constitutionalism? So it got me pissed off. So that's why I wrote this paper, the background to this paper, quite a while ago. So I still get a bit annoyed. He was a great boss, by the way. So what about Māori constitutional culture? All right. A couple of quotes here from Te Hākure Arohmai, Eri Jury. Again, this idea of bottom-up. Political power vested at the base of the community or the hapu level. Power flowed from the people up, not from the top down. So that's echoing a bit of what Sir John Salmon was saying. Control from a superordinate authority is antithetical to the Māori system. And then Tākuta Moana Jackson, Moi mai rā, Moana. For me, a constitution is just a kawa, or the rules that people make to govern themselves. Simply put, the rules we make to govern ourselves. The kawa of the marae is the constitution of a marae. It's the rules that govern how people should behave on a marae. So there's nothing flash about this word constitution or constitutionalism. So yeah, I argue that Māori are a distinct constitutional people beyond the hapu. And Sam talked to kind of like the change in thinking and ideas that was seen before 1840. Well, that change of thinking and ideas in Ngāpuhi was likely to have been present along quite a few decades prior to 1840. There's all kinds of ideas that were percolating and changing, like the cohering of particular hapu and iwi for particular purposes, and that te whakamenenga did not come out of nothing. Te whakamenenga was, and if you read the Ngāpuhi report in regards to the claim over whether or not sovereignty was ever ceded, that comes out very clearly. This idea of te whakamenenga was not something that was new. It was building on older models that had already been in place. But yeah, don't try and understand Maori constitutionalism or Ngāpuhi constitutionalism or Kaitahu constitutionalism by looking at the organs of the constitution. Don't try and understand Māori land and the relationship between people and land by looking at the operations of the Māori Land Court. You have to actually look at what the people are doing and what the people are saying. And so the other thing not to do, and I touched on this before, is you don't just look at words like self-determination or autonomy or nationhood or rangatiratanga and try and get an understanding of the constitutionality of a people by looking at the buzzwords. You look at what they do and you look at you look at what they say, but you don't look for the buzzwords, or you don't weight them too much. And I was interested in what Sam said about the absence of the word sovereignty, relative absence of the word sovereignty compared to kawanatanga in those texts that you were looking at, because I've got a similar phenomenon that happened with my research as well, which we'll come to. So I argue that there's such a thing as the Maori Deimos. I like a former classic student, so I just like Greek. But this idea that at a certain point in time, and this would have been different for different hapu and different iwi, is that there is entry into the thinking of making decisions, not just on behalf of your own kin group or your close kin groups, but on behalf of and for the benefit of people who you don't know. That thinking transcends the idea of the Māori ethnos or our kin groups, our kin-based collectives. It comprises the idea of Māori collectives utilising collective choice for disinterested collective ends, but at the same time being able to still look after your own as well. These things are not in tension with each other, they're manifestations of the same thing. But this bit, I think, is quite important. The ultimate goal of the decision-making process is the survival of Māori people. I don't know if any of you have read any of Whaitarangi Winiata's work with regards to whakatupuranga rua mano. If you pick up his latest book that he released, I think it was last year, and you read through it, he's talking about the development that started in Otaki in 1975 for the iwi and the hapu of Otaki, Te Atiawa and Ngāti Toa to come together to find the survival, the pathway to survival for those particular iwi, right? And so that the constant theme through that book is survival. And that's what Maori constitutionalism is aiming at, is survival. It's survival of the language, survival of ways of doing things, retention and gaining back land. It's all about survival. And of course, at the hapu and iwi level, Māori are doing that anyway, but the new thing that we start to see in the early decades of the 19th century is this idea of cohering for those disinterested purposes for other Māori who may not be in the room. That doesn't mean to say it's political unity, right? There's lots of political disunity with human beings. And the other point that's really clear too when we're talking about ideas of Maori constitutionalism, I mentioned before that often we're talking about the absence of power, and where power resides in Māori communities is very disparate, not a sovereign authority top down, or the flowing of power from one putative source down through its tendrils and fingers into other parts of the community, but distinct sites of power. So again, very different. I won't have time to go into this too much today, but some of the other research that we've been looking at recently has been the role of the hui. Now, Sam was talking about the role of assemblies. Well, assemblies are just big fat hui, and assemblies carried on, but hui carried on. More particularly, the Māori process of hui is incredibly important, and I would say it is the preeminent institution of Māori constitutionalism. And hui carry on today, often smaller, often not what people recall from the old days, but still every so often you'll get Māori gathering for these big hui, and these are constitutional events, I think. I won't have time to go into that today because hui are places where law is made, actually, and concepts of Māori law are promulgated through hui, not necessarily on the marae either, and not necessarily in Te Reo Māori. So I kind of call this instinct of kind of coming together that forms the basis of Maori Constitutionalism, I call it civic collectivism, and I've also called it civic whanaungatanga. And what we see in 1830 on is we see the growth of the three necessary preconditions for the development of the civic collectivism or civic whanaungatanga among Northern Māori at least. We'd seen this in the late decades of the 18th century, but an increased willingness for tribal groupings, even non-affiliated groups, to cohere for specific purposes. I mentioned that before. So that's not new in the 1830s, but it is developing. Secondly, there's the acceptance of the idea of a Māori supra-tribal identity, right? And we see some of that also in documentation. We see it even in the words of the treaty, this idea of this phrase, tangata Māori, right? Tangata Māori. And the acceptance that tangata Māori are somehow separate to and opposite to others, right? Not just identifying by virtue of hapu and iwi affiliation, but also this idea of tangata Māori, the people, the normal people, because tangata Māori with a small m, ordinary people, normal people. But actually, over time, there is invested in that phrase something a bit more concrete, this idea of the supra-tribal identity. And I come back to this idea of who you're making your decisions for. So by the time the treaty is signed, Te Tiriti is signed in 1840, all those preconditions for civic collectivism. So what I'm getting to here is that, this is something my cousin Hami Piripi said back in 2011, that Te Tiriti was the first sign of, it's up there, sorry, the first evidence of commitment to a public good in New Zealand. I think actually probably we're getting there a bit earlier with the declaration, but certainly it's much more manifest by the time we get to 1840. So we can see the signing of the treaty as an act of civic collectivism. Those who signed knew they're not just signing on their own behalf; they're also signing they're signing something bigger on behalf of other people as well. So I mentioned before this kind of tensions that I saw in action at the conference, but and so this is not an unusual thing, this tension between acting on behalf of your own people and cohering to the extent that you're meeting the needs of your own people. There's not necessarily a massive tension between that and the developing of this broader Māori civic collectivism, but there is a tension between these two things. So that's something that's marked Māori economic and social history in the last couple of hundred years. And you see this in this kind of tension between Article 2 and Article 3, right? So you have Article 2, protection of taonga, rangatiratanga, and then Article 3, the notion of the rights and obligations of British citizenship, right? There's a shift in orientation that we get in Article 3. There's debate to be had about that as well, but I don't have time for that today. This was fun. All right, so what we did, I co-ran a project called the Legal Māori Project, which finished in 2000, kind of finished just not that long ago, but we produced the first Māori dictionary of legal terms. So it's the first legal Māori dictionary. And we gathered a corpus of about 8 million running tokens, word tokens, and of documentation, Māori legal documentation in Māori. So that went from kind of newspaper reports through to acts and bills, through to petitions, through to correspondence, a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the things that I did when I was writing this paper, or the origins of this paper a few years back, was I thought, look, there are lots and lots of constitutional milestones or moments that have documents attached to them in our corpus. Why don't we get all those documents out, bring them all together, make a little sub-corpus and see what comes out. So what I've got on the screen there is some of the constitutional moments, if you like, that we collected and then gathered. We've got about a million tokens or million word tokens, created a sub-corpus of these that were all attached to these moments, right from the signing of He Whakaputanga in 1835 through to, the passage of the Foreshore and Seabed Act, in other words, the submissions on that Foreshore and Seabed Act proposal. And so, yeah, and I ran them through a software program called Wordsmith, because I wanted to do something similar to what Sam did, which is look at the presence of words in this corpus, right? When people are debating this kind of lifeblood stuff about the Constitution, these particular events in particular, they're not the only constitutional events, they're just a selection of them. And what kind of vocab would come out, what kind of words would come out. And there's a function called keywords function, and that kind of looks at not just the frequency of words, but to what extent are those words stereotypical in that set of texts. So not just are they frequent, but how stereotypical are they? How key are these words? And these are the key words that we had that came out of this bunch of texts. Funnily enough, first up, Tikanga. This is an order of keyness. Pitihana, petition, right? There are lots of petitions being filed and signed. Kāwanatanga, ritenga, normal way of doing things, practicing, customs. Runanga, assembly, yeah? Whakahaere, practice or manage. Kotahitanga, and kotahitanga, probably has a keenness because of the kotahitanga parliament, so that's a name that was coming up time and time again. Mana. Oh, sorry. So, when you look at your words, Sam, in those British documents, and then you look at these words in these Māori language documents, what doesn't appear here and didn't appear as a key term is rangatiratanga. Right? And
Ture hasn't turned up, which surprises me.
Ture hasn't turned up, no. It can be very frequent, but not necessarily key. So, yeah, I don't know. And that sub, it probably might be key in the big corpus of 8 million word tokens, but not in the constitutional milestones corpus. So, yeah, but certainly what we get there is a sense of Māori seeking participation, those words like runanga, ritenga, pitihana, Māori ways of doing things, tikanga, ritenga, and whakahaere, of course, and mana. So these are the kinds of ideas and concepts that are bubbling to the surface. Now, who knows exactly how scientific this is, but I thought it was interesting. All right. Now, I don't have time to go into it today, digging a bit deeper into what those assemblies were doing and what those constitutional moments were representing. And I do go into a bit of detail on the other research that I did, and I don't have time to do that here. But when you look at those moments and the texts around those moments, there are some things that come out, and they have implications for how constitutional development ought to go in this country for Māori. And one thing is that civic decision-making power ought to be exercised as a means of meeting collective obligations for civic ends, right? So collectivity is a big deal. Civic decision-making ought to be carried out in such a way that preserves group participation. This is kind of what we get from the words that were floating to the top there. Runanga, pitihana, participation, right? The idea of cohering and gathering, using our own tikanga, upholding the mana of each other. So there are certain things that give a few little nudges in the way of where our constitutional thinking should go. I kind of mentioned, I'm wrapping up shortly, so it's a little bit of a quick trot, sorry, but I just wanted to finish off by talking about some of the tensions that I saw. So that constitutional milestones and those moments, that covers quite a large period of time and it's still carrying on today. So, you've got a broad sweep of Māori social and economic history there in that last 200 years. One of the things Sam said at the end of his presentation was about Māori being shut out. And when you look at the history of something like social welfare, for example, and the history of social security in Aotearoa, New Zealand, this big monolithic thing that doles out benefits and most proportionally more Māori in receipt of benefits than other people. What you see when you look at a phenomenon like that is you see Māori trying for the last 200 years to create group-based responses to provide for Māori welfare, i.e. the survival of the Māori people. The Kiangitanga is a really good example of that. For example, there was thinking of Māori welfare right at the heart of the establishment of the Kiangitanga. Putatau Te Whero might not have signed Te Tiriti, but by 1858, he'd certainly worked out those ideas of authority. So there's this picture of Māori not having the power, but trying to use that civic decision-making to affect civic ends for Māori people, the survival of the Māori, of Māori communities. And so when I was listening to these conversations in the last few days up here in Auckland, one thing I was listening for was the place of Te Tiriti in those discussions. Because, in my view anyway, Te Tiriti is not a product of, it's not foundational to Maori constitutionalism. Te Tiriti is a product of Maori constitutionalism. There's a difference. It's a product of it. We would not have Te Tiriti if it weren't for Maori constitutional thinking. You don't necessarily have people talking Te Tiriti at marae committee hui, for example. There's all kinds of things that happen in the Māori world where Te Tiriti is not mentioned, right? So you listen to what people do and you look at what they say. Sorry, listen to what they say and look at what they do. However, it's a framework for relationship and a framework for accountability. And so that was definitely the sense that I got listening to the Constitutional Kōrero earlier on this week. When we have tensions, sorry, I'll just get the notes I had on that. When we have tensions on what to do from here on out, moving towards 2040, because the tensions that I saw at the Constitutional Kōrero showed the risks of certain approaches, and I will just take a minute to just finish this off. Incrementalism, that I described before, sees that the public good for Māori survival can be achieved by enhancing the relationship between the Crown and Māori, by Māori becoming part of and influencing and shifting the Crown, while at the same time as Māori having the freedom to exercise that rangatiratanga that's protected by Article 2. Article 1, kawanatanga, Article 2, rangatiratanga connect on this thinking. They relate and depend on each other in this thinking. The approach runs the risk, however, of allowing damage to Māori concepts, of allowing damage to Māori thought at that interface between Te Ao Māori and the state legal system. And so that was the concerns raised by people like Annette Sykes and Ani Makaere at the Constitutional Kōrero, was the damage that introducing Māori thinking and Māori values into processes of decision-making in government, that it actually damages that thinking. So there's a risk there that comes from that interface. Incrementalism, so the thinking goes, also runs the risk of failing to hold the Crown to account enough by being invested too much in relationship with the Crown, by allowing kawanatanga to interfere in the rangatiratanga space, if you see these two spaces as separate. Whereas I think with incrementalism, you see them as interwoven somehow. Transformation sees the kawanatanga sphere and the rangatiratanga sphere as separate, Māori in one, more or less, Crown in the other. Effectively, Māori grow and develop and make decisions based on Māori imperatives in the rangatiratanga space to achieve the public good of Māori survival. The relationship with the Crown is one of fiscal and moral accountability for the protection of rangatiratanga in Article 2, and for ensuring that kawanatanga in Article 1 recognises and is responsive to Māori in the exercise of kawanatanga powers. But transformational approaches also run the risk of not being able to garner that majority political support needed to require the state to give up enough power to enable that rangatiratanga space to function properly. So this in turn may require some Māori collectives to retreat into the exercise of rangatiratanga without sufficient resources, potentially undermining the concept of the public good for Māori survival. There was a nice example at the conference where a man stood up and talked about how he refuses to pay for his, he makes his own licence plates and he still gets picked up by the Crown, and there was some discussion about not paying rates. This idea that in order to exercise rangatiratanga we should retreat into the rangatiratanga sphere and not deal with the Crown at all. And there is where you get the connection with the sovereign citizen movement, that radical individualism that we've seen in recent months as well, or recent years. So, there are risks associated with both incrementalism and transformation. How do you resolve these tensions? I don't know. Maybe the binary isn't as stark as I suggest, but those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking forward in the next 18 years to 2040. And I don't know how I mashed all that together, but I'm sorry I've gone over time.